everyone, welcome back to English 247. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 6th of June. So as you know, I gave you an extension on the Frankenstein journal. Thank you to those of you who have already submitted in the journal. But the journal is due today, if you're watching this video on the 6th, by 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And as you know, I'm not evaluating for grammar or mechanics, just for content, as if we were having a conversation on paper, and using a checkmark system rather than the traditional letter grades for evaluation. So a plus is excellent. A check plus is very good. And I'm happy to say that usually that's where the grades fall. There also is a check for satisfactory, check minus less than satisfactory, and a minus unsatisfactory. And your first journal is about Frankenstein, though certainly you could make reference to some of what we've talked about thus far, such as The Cult of True Womanhood, or even The Story of an Hour. But our first major text is Frankenstein. And what I wanted to talk about today are some quotations and places in the text that I think are important. I had started this last class by talking about the letters that Walton writes to a Mrs. Seville. This is Walton's sister, yet he refers to her by her married title. Again, that says everything about the role of female in society, something that we saw with Mrs. Mallard. And when Walton's letters continue, and you can see this in the notes below, he talks about how he had preferred glory and enticement to any kind of wealth that was placed in his path. And there will definitely be parallels with Victor as well. So a very interesting paper. We'll talk about papers today too. Might be comparing and contrasting Victor and Walton. Walton also talks about the idea that he feels isolated, that he has no friend. In part, he's done that to himself by preferring to try to satisfy his hubris, his excessive arrogance and pride, rather than having, let's say, the nurturing of family. I've always suggested that this text is a horror tale about what happens with the exclusion of female in society, which would make sense because Mary Shelley, female, is embedding feminist commentary within this text. It's just not quite as obvious as in some of the upcoming texts. And in fact, I had even suggested that while on the surface it appears there are no strong female characters, Mother Nature certainly takes a large role. Obviously, it's quite healing and restorative. Whenever Walton and Victor are in the midst of Mother Nature, they are quite comforted. And of course, when they isolate themselves, they experience the opposite. That said, there is a character by the name of Justine that I wanted to talk a little bit about when we come up. As we had discussed, the novel has much more complexity than the film, the 1930s film. Though there's a 1990s version of Frankenstein by Kenneth Branagh and Robert De Niro, and that's more accurate to the text, though of course each adaptation will be taking its liberties. But I wanted us to see the 1930s version because it's really what made Frankenstein so iconic. You'd be hard-pressed to go to a Halloween party and probably not find a Frankenstein somewhere or another. But the Frankenstein you see is not the creature that Mary Shelley gives us. What we see is the movie version of the, quote, monstrosity, unquote. And as I've always argued, it's Victor and humanity as a whole that are the true monsters because they basically reject this creature, mostly because of its physical appearance. And that said, I think there are lots of ways that we could view this text from a contemporary perspective, particularly when we're talking about things like racism and sexism and classism that oftentimes are based on surface appearance. And also, as progressive as the text is, as I had suggested last class, we will see Mary Shelley's own biases. Definitely we see that with Walton. One of the reasons why he has no friends is because he feels he's superior to his crewmates. So this sense of the European having a superior position in society is something we will see with Victor as well. And Walton goes on and he says that in letter 4 that he runs across a traveler, and he's not an inhabitant of some savage island undiscovered. Again, that says everything about the idea associated with the non-European. But he was a European, so he feels that Victor is an equal, so they can have conversation with one another. And Victor says that he sought for domination. This is in his 4th letter. And he is cautioning Walton not to do the same. So this is very much a morality tale in many respects. When Victor says that he was a slave of passion. And then this is the frame for us to get into Victor's story. But as we know, this is an epistolary novel told through letters. So everything that follows afterwards, these are the stories that are embedded in the letters to Walton's sister. So ultimately, we have one narrator, and that happens to be Walton. We never directly hear from Victor. We never directly hear from the creature. That certainly complicates the narrative because it leads to the question of reliability and how much we can trust Walton considering he's under physical and emotional strain. And certainly one of the ways that this text has been read is that this is all a personification of his own inner struggles. I think it's a less interesting way to read the text, thinking about it just as Walton's sort of subconscious struggles, and thinking about Victor and the creature as actual entities. I think it's much more interesting. But of course, if you like the idea of narrative ambiguity, then you're definitely going to like the way this text is constructed. And many of you indicated that you did like that when the last discussion question, when I was asking you about the epistolary novel technique. And even if Victor does exist, certainly there are a number of reasons why Walton may not necessarily have gotten the narrative down correctly. Obviously, he's writing after the fact and at night when he has time. This is long after Victor has told him his story. And also Walton is physically and emotionally drained, so there could be errors. We could say the same for Victor as well. And if Victor does exist, again, we can't be assured that there is a creature. This could also be a figment of Victor's imagination. And certainly we could say that Walton saw the creature, but it wouldn't necessarily be a stretch that could be a hallucination. But again, I would prefer to think of Walton, Victor, and the creature as actually existing, and that each of them have their story to tell, of course, told through Walton. And Victor's story in chapter 1, as he talks about, I think this is a very interesting quote, his childhood, when he says that I was my parents' plaything and their idol, and something better, their child. I think this is quite illuminative. First of all, that Victor had a good childhood, talk about irony, and yet he isn't able to transfer that over to his own creation. A creation that he never even names. So Frankenstein is the name of the creator. The creature never gets a name. So one could say that Victor negates one of the primary responsibilities of parenthood almost immediately, which is naming one's child or creation. Also, the fact that he says that he was his parents' plaything and their idol, as if he's a possession. And certainly Victor treats the creature as if it's a possession. Elizabeth is treated that way as well. If we think about the cult of true womanhood, perhaps that's not too surprising because women were often viewed as possessions and property. Victor talks a little bit about how Elizabeth was included into his family, that she is adopted and she's motherless, and we'll see this theme of motherless children throughout the semester, that Elizabeth was thin and very fair. In other words, she looked European, so that's one of the reasons why she was adopted. And again, we see Shelley's European bias. And that, in effect, Elizabeth is sort of assumed to be Victor's, that eventually they will marry. He calls Elizabeth his cousin. They are raised as if they're brother and sister, but they aren't blood related. I know that kind of marriage might seem somewhat unusual, but as we move into Persuasion, you'll see that it was not at all unusual for cousins who are blood related to marry and during this time period in order to be able to maintain inheritance and wealth and also social position. Victor talks about in the second chapter that the world was him as a secret that he desired to divine. It was the secrets of heaven and earth that I desired. I believe I had mentioned Dr. Faustus in the last class video, or the previous video to that. It is a Renaissance drama written by one of Shakespeare's contemporaries, Christopher Marlowe, about a scholar who's achieved all earthly knowledge and makes a pact with the devil in order to be able to get supernatural knowledge, with the agreement that at the ending of a certain period of time, Faustus will relinquish his soul to the devil. And it's a cautionary tale. It's another morality tale about the dangers of wanting excessive knowledge, that which is not supposed to be natural. Think about the idea of Prometheus stealing from the gods and the consequences as a result of that. And Victor says that he basically wants the secrets of heaven and earth. We could say Walton does as well. And some knowledge is not supposed to be known. I've always said this would be a wonderful text to read in the sciences and in any kind of technological field where there is discovery and creation, or as I said, I believe so eloquently in a popular film, Jurassic Park. Just because you can, that doesn't mean you should. And Victor is able to accomplish what he accomplishes, but that doesn't mean that he should do it. And this is twofold. The first is the creation, which is unnatural. Creation is supposed to be limited to God or to female. Notice how Victor usurps the role of female. And then secondly, once the creation is made, the responsibility to the rearing and the guiding of that creation, which Victor negates completely. So by the ending of the novel, Victor's not a very attractive character. We're not supposed to feel empathy really for Victor. We do feel empathy for the creature who was an innocent and created, if you've ever heard about the tabula rasa, or the blank slate, and the question of nature versus nurture. And the sense is one's personality determined by genetics, or is one's personality determined by environment? And usually it's a combination of the two. But we could think of the creature and in his initial creation, it seems like he's benevolent. And it's only after he begins to witnesses the crimes and the evil of humanity that he turns to begin to mimic those crimes and evils, which I'll talk about in a moment. In chapter 4, Victor says he shunned his fellow creatures as if he'd been guilty of a crime during the process of his creation. I think there are two things that are interesting here. First of all is that the sense of isolation. Secondly, he is guilty of a crime, and he never quite acknowledges that. The creation scene comes rather late compared to what we expect from Hollywood. It's in chapter 5. It's a dreary night in November. It's quite gothic. It's raining. It's dark. There's supernatural entities, or the possibility of supernatural entities. I talked a little bit about Cornelius Agrippa, the very famous occultist, and the Philosopher's Stone, the attempt to make everlasting life. Though certainly the creation scene is also connected to science fiction, and the idea of science fiction is that this is something that can be created through natural means. It just hasn't been discovered yet. Think about the beginnings of the understandings of electricity and the importance of electricity for the creation. And I always like the idea too of light and illumination, because this text is supposed to be illuminative in terms of what happens when one allows one's ego and ambition to cloud one's better judgment. And then when we move forward to chapter 6, Elizabeth says to Victor, I'm very fond of this line in chapter 6, Justine, you may remember, was a great favorite of yours. As talented as Mary Shelley was, basically a teenager creating this tale, that's not to say that there aren't places that perhaps the writing stretches disbelief a little bit or might seem a little awkward. I would suggest this is one of them. If Justine was a great favorite of Victor's, he wouldn't need to be reminded of that, would he? The letter where Elizabeth says to Victor, Justine, you might remember, was a great favorite of yours. That's Mary Shelley's way of giving us some exposition, some background information about Justine. So perhaps that could have been done a little bit more smoothly, but again, who am I to critique a text that has never been out of print? So we know that upon the creation scene that Victor is so horrified by the appearance of his creation that he runs, and ultimately he abandons the creature. And then we find the consequences of that when we hear the creature story. He basically is left to fend for himself. So as the chapters continue, what we learn about Justine is that eventually the creature, after much trial and tribulation, comes across Victor's brother, William. And when the creature finds out that William is related to Victor, of course, the creature, in an angry rage, kills William. And it turns out that Justine was out searching for William because he hadn't returned home and she was sleeping. And the creature ends up taking a miniature of that William had on him and placing it on Justine. In other words, basically framing Justine for the crime. Again, his argument being that he learned evil through humanity. There's a certain level of truth to that, though we can't necessarily justify murder. It has a lot of modern day parallels to children who are perhaps reared in less than ideal circumstances, and ultimately it's not their fault, but at some point they have to take responsibility for their actions. We can't just continue to justify their actions because they were reared badly or didn't have rearing at all. And I think that's one of the ways that this text has some modern day connections. But what's more interesting, I think, from our perspective is that when Justine is tried, first of all, Victor doesn't speak up. Victor is quite convinced that this is the creature's doing. And again, Victor has all kinds of rationalizations, almost like Dr. Faustus in that play, has all kinds of rationalizations for what he's doing. He won't be believed or whatever the case may happen to be. But certainly it doesn't seem that Victor wants to put himself at risk. Nevertheless, Justine is executed, and this is because she confessed, but she never committed the crime. And what she says in chapter 8 is, I did confess, but I confessed a lie. I confessed that I might obtain absolution. So that gets us back to the cult of true womanhood and the importance of things like piety for female, that she could basically be bullied into confessing a lie because she's threatened with hellfire if she doesn't do so. So, as we learn the creature story, and coincidentally, it just so turns out that the creature ran off with one of Victor's jackets that happens to have information in the pocket about who Victor is and how the creature was created. So the creature learns about its origins through reading as well, as the creature eventually teaches itself to read. And that's supposed to explain, again, I don't know if it's necessarily done as smoothly as it could be, how the creature gets knowledge of its creation and how it should pursue the Frankenstein family. But we do know that the creature is quite articulate. He spends not only time observing the Lacey family, which is a plot that usually is not included in film, but is able to teach itself language because the DeLacys happen to be teaching someone language, so the creature is able to learn from that respect. And again, I don't know if that's necessarily the smoothest way to explain the creature's ability to read or the creature's ability to speak. He's quite eloquent. Certainly very different than the Hollywood version of the creature, which is just a grunting sort of creature. The nature versus nurture debate, as I was indicating, when the creature is first created, it appreciates nature. It talks about the beauty of the natural world. This is seen as something that's a good of the creature. It's an element of benevolence. And it also engages in benevolent activities. So when it finds out that it is actually taking some of the food stores of the DeLacy family, it stops. Or the creature stops, and he actually tries to assist the DeLacy family by getting them firewood. So one would say that the nature of the creature is initially good. It's the nurture of the creature, as he is continually rejected over and over again by humanity, that teaches it evil. And the creature uses reason and is able to compare itself to Adam and Satan. Again, one of my chuckles about this book is that the creature just happens to find a satchel of books in the wilderness and reads these books and is able to learn about the history of humanity. Again, we do have to suspend disbelief. And also learns about Adam and Satan and Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost, a great epic poem that's very important to the literary tradition, that's supposed to be about the fall of man, though the star of the poem tends to be Satan, who comes off as a rather empathetic character. And this idea of Satan being excluded, ignored, and ultimately ostracized from heaven, even though Satan was the brightest of angels. Of course, if you know the biblical story, and obviously there's a Christian bias embedded in this text as well, illustrating Shelley's own Christian bias. Well, then, if we know the story, then ultimately Satan tempted Eve to eat the apple of knowledge. And think about how this entire text is about forbidden knowledge. And then ultimately Eve tempts Adam to do the same, which is why they are excluded from paradise, which is what they had been in previously. He says that in many ways he's much like Satan, who's been abandoned by his creator, Satan being abandoned by God, the creature being abandoned by Victor, and also this idea of Adam being thrust out of paradise by its creator to fend for itself. So the creature story, which is what we get starting around chapter 11, is, and at this point it's because the creature has actually tracked down Victor and wants to convince Victor to create a mate for the creature so the creature doesn't live in isolation. And so this is how we hear the creature's backstory as the creature relates what happened to him while Victor basically took to his sickbed. Notice how often that happens to Victor, that he becomes overcome, he swoons, he faints. Many of these actions are oftentimes considered quite effeminate. But nevertheless, the creature story is that the DeLacy family is headed by a blind old man. This is a complicated narrative in which the family was exiled because of an injustice, and ultimately Felix DeLacy tried to stand up for the rights of someone who had experienced an injustice, was falsely accused, and the payment for that supposedly was to get Safie. Again, think about how female is presented as possession or property to be given away by her father. This was a false promise just so that her father could get Felix's assistance to be released. He never wanted his daughter to be with Felix because Felix is a Christian and Safie is an Arab. So again, we have some interesting commentary embedded in this text about religion. But at any rate, going on, the creature says in chapter 13, this is, I think, an important quote, was man indeed at once so powerful, so virtuous and magnificent, yet so vicious and base? And the short answer to that is, oh yeah. So, and I think we see that every day in the news. So we learned a little bit about Safie's backstory, and we don't have many female characters, so this is kind of interesting. This is in chapter 14, where we find out that she was a Christian Arab, Safie's mother, who taught Safie to aspire to the higher powers of intellect and independence of spirit, forbidden to the female followers of Muhammad. So I guess we can have gradations of the levels of independence and empowerment of female depending on religious observance. And the assumption is that Christianity allows more than, let's say, the female followers of Muhammad. But in chapter 14, we learn that Safie's father loathed the idea that his daughter should be united to a Christian. So in chapter 15, this is where we find out that how the creature knows all of this information. The creature says that soon after my arrival in the hovel, I discovered some papers in the pocket of the dress, which I had taken from your laboratory. So again, this is how the creature knows its origin of creation. So he's able to find Victor, to confront Victor and say that I've been abandoned, I've been isolated, and you owe me at the very least a companion, much like Adam had a companion in Eve. And the creature says in chapter 16, only on you had I any claim for pity and redress. Going back to Safie, one of the more interesting things is that Safie decides to defy her father, not an easy thing to do during the time period, and pursues Victor or not Victor, I'm sorry, pursues Felix and the DeLacy family. She has to basically go through long travels in order to be able to find them because at this point they've been exiled. And she does this basically independently. Someone not knowing the language and not knowing the culture. So if we're looking for a strong female, Safie, even though she doesn't play a major role in the text, is a strong female. Nevertheless, the creature tries to befriend the DeLacy family, hoping that because the patriarch is blind, he will accept the creature. And the plan seems to be working until the rest of the family arrives. The family is so horrified by the creature's appearance that basically it runs off, and the creature is once again left alone and isolated. The scene with the little girl, I think, is always so telling because in the Hollywood film, it's a little girl who befriends the creature and they're throwing flower petals into the water, and the creature, not understanding that throwing the girl in the water would have the consequences of death, tries to throw her in the water in the way, or does throw her in the water in the way that they were throwing flower petals, and she consequently dies. We see that it's a very different kind of story in the text Frankenstein, where there's a little girl drowning. And despite the fact that the creature's been rejected by his creator, despite the fact that it's been rejected by the DeLacy family, it still tries to save the girl. Again, its initial instinct being benevolent, and he's attacked and shot at for that. So at this point, he decides, the creature, that he's going to find Victor and at the very least demand a mate, which I think we can empathize with because the creature is alone. But note how the creature asks for the creation of a female merely for its own benefit. So I think there's some gender commentary in there as well. And the creature says in chapter 16, "Only on you," he's talking to Victor, "had I any claim for pity and redress." And Victor, in typical Victor fashion, in chapter 19, said, "I felt as if I had created some great crime, or as if I had committed some great crime. I was guiltless, but I had indeed drawn down a horrible curse upon my head." And I would say, oh, he's guilty of some great crime. Of course, we know that Victor begins to create this creature and then decides to abandon it. And some of the rationale seems to be a bit of a stretch, that perhaps this female creature will breed. My suspicion is that if Victor can create life from death, he can create a female that is not fertile. But nevertheless, moving forward, the idea that the female might reject the creature, which is certainly a possibility, or the idea that the creature and the female could unite together and wreak havoc upon humanity. But Victor decides to destroy his creation, which not necessarily the smartest of moves, but perhaps we can rationalize it. That said, Victor never considers what he should have considered in the first place, not create another creature, but to offer his creation his companionship and love and attention. And that would have solved much of this dilemma, which again shows Victor's self-centeredness and arrogance. We know that ultimately, after Victor destroys the creature is bent on revenge and telling Victor that "I will be with you on your wedding night." Again, in typical Victor fashion, he just assumes that the creature is going to pursue him, Victor. Never once does he consider that, of course, the best way to hurt somebody is to hurt the person that they love. So we have the murder of Elizabeth and then the murder of Clerval. And Clerval and Victor's relationship is quite interesting. They're best friends. They were raised together. It's quite intimate. In fact, one might say that it's much more emotionally intimate than any kind of relationship Victor ever had with Elizabeth. Again, Elizabeth was sort of groomed and reared for the idea that she should marry Victor, but Victor seems to confide more in Clerval and rely more on Clerval than he ever does on Elizabeth. In fact, she even questions at one point, have you found someone else? Because Victor's gone for long periods of time. And said, in fact, the text oftentimes has been read as perhaps a homoerotic commentary on the relationship between Victor and Clerval. I don't know if I would go necessarily that far, but that said, they do have a sense of connection and intimacy that we don't necessarily see with Victor and Elizabeth. Perhaps that's a commentary on arranged marriages as well. And the creature murders the two people who are the most important in Victor's life, Elizabeth and Clerval. This is when we finally return back to chapter 24. We get back to Walton. So if we forgot, and it's quite easy to forget, we are now reminded that all of this is told through a series of letters through Walton. And Victor is talking to Walton's crew, which has become mutinous at this point because it's so dangerous and it seems to be so useless, their pursuit of trying to find a new geographic passageway. And it's a very dangerous endeavor. And what Victor says to the crew is so telling in chapter 24. Be men or be more than men. Be steady to your purposes and firm as a rock. This was the same Victor who at the beginning said, don't follow my mistakes. And yet he's telling the men, continue to pursue this forbidden knowledge. So Victor vacillates throughout the entire novel. Yes, there are many times where he seems to express some level of regret, but he backtracks continually. The creature talks about in chapter 24, impotent envy and bitter indignation filled me with an insatiable thirst for vengeance. I was the slave, not the master, of an impulse which I detested, yet could not disobey. So that's part of the servitude mastery theme that I was referencing at the beginning of the novel. And the idea, again, that the creature has basically learned how to be evil through its treatment by humanity. And the novel ends with chapter 24, where the creature is saying, I shall collect my funeral pile and consume to ashes this miserable frame. By this point, Victor has succumbed to illness and is dead. So, this cat and mouse game that he was playing with Victor, chasing him across the wilderness and ultimately Arctic regions has come to an end. That if Victor doesn't exist anymore, there really isn't any reason for the creature to exist. Perhaps a commentary on this, again, idea of parent-child relationship and the love and hate that can exist within parent-child relationship. Nevertheless, the creature decides to commit suicide, though we never know for certain if the creature commits suicide, always leaving open the possibility of a sequel. But the sense is that the creature has a certain level of nobility and that it understands that it will never be accepted in society, so that it basically is going to put itself and humanity out of its misery by eliminating its existence. So this is not a happy ending. This is not like the Hollywood ending. Just about everybody is dead except Walton. If there is a happy ending, it's because of Walton, is that he has decided to turn back from this very dangerous passage, and perhaps he's learned something. And of course, the lesson is for us as reader, that we should be very cautious about, as I had said earlier, just because we can, that doesn't mean we should, as well as other messages and morals that happen to be embedded within this text. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the elements to discuss with Frankenstein. Again, journal number 2, if you haven't already submitted that, please do so. And eventually there will be a paper due. And if I need to put a little bit of an extension on that, because again, I'm cognizant of the time. It seems to be we're falling behind a little bit, but that's fine. The idea is that about midway through the semester, you would write approximately a 4 to 5 page paper, double-spaced, 1-inch margins, and it would, unlike the journals, which are basically just kind of a running commentary or thoughts or questions and ideas, that you would be following a specific thesis or specific idea, and examining that in depth. And I had given you some suggested paper topics, which are in the syllabus and other documents folder. And that would also be that paper submitted via PDF to my email, Ruiz, Ruiz, @gcc.mass.edu. It's a critical paper. In other words, you're not doing outside research, you're relying on your own interpretations and understandings. And the first paper would probably be addressing the first set of readings, which could be Frankenstein and Persuasion, perhaps The Story of an Hour. The writing on a short story is a very different kind of exercise. Perhaps even Jane Eyre, but ultimately Jane Eyre I think is better suited for possibility for the second paper, just in terms of the way that the dates are structured over the course of the semester. And for your first paper, you can rewrite it for a higher grade, so you can see it as a kind of draft, if you will, because I did want to talk about some of the elements of how to write a paper. I won't necessarily have an opportunity to do that in depth today, but I can do more so next class. And hopefully this is review because you've taken English Comp 2 and English 101. So you're accustomed to writing a paper. You're also accustomed to writing about literature. But I still want to go through some of the elements. And certainly you can incorporate journals into your paper. So I'm hopeful that perhaps the journals might help inspire you. You can even utilize some of the elements within the journals in your paper. You can see in the notes below, I've indicated we're a little bit behind schedule, which we are. And eventually you will have a second paper, which will be due at the ending of the semester on the latter set of readings. And that would be due at the very ending of the semester. So you wouldn't have time to rewrite it. That said, I have had some students who have handed it in early enough so that there would be a possibility for revision, but that's something that you have to negotiate with me. It's not necessarily guaranteed. So, I have a handout that I'll be talking about next class entitled Grading Criteria and Handout on Writing Papers. And we'll talk about that. And it'll talk a little bit about the structure of writing a paper. And I will also talk about Purdue OWL, which is a great writing resource, as well as the GCC library. So there's some notes here about paper number 1 that I'll be addressing next class. But I wanted to get into at least persuasion a little bit because according to our syllabus, this is what we should be discussing. So even though we're approximately a class behind or so, the ideal is that you're able to keep up with the reading. And persuasion, I'm hopeful that you have finished reading Frankenstein at this point and that you are in the midst of persuasion, is the story of the British landed gentry. It's a life of leisure, status, title, money, and property. And as I had warned you, this novel moves very slowly because their lives moved very slowly. We see the writing structure sort of reflect that with these long classical sentences with very little action. So it might be a bit of a slog to get through. If you've ever wondered how the privileged live, certainly in this time period, this is our view behind the curtains, so to speak. And individuals would marry either within or above their station. It was always a question of trying to make a good match. And we talked a little bit about Mrs. Mallard being a widow and what that might mean for her in terms of financial security and independence. Sir Walter is a widower. That's one of the things we learned very early on in the text. And the concern is that he's going to remarry. And if he does remarry, then that ultimately is going to change things in terms of inheritances. There are no male heirs. There are only female daughters. So it's uncertain what could happen to the inheritance. And we get the story of those 3 female daughters. And quite honestly, we're not really supposed to like any of these characters, except for Anne, our female protagonist, who basically, it's through her eyes that we see her family. What I suggest is that you keep a chart of family relationships, and there are quite complex relationships. I'm going to list a series of characters next class, and they oftentimes are referred to by multiple names, and they oftentimes have similar names, so you want to keep track of that. And the title is so important. To influence, gently influence, is really what persuasion is. And we will see that theme played out throughout the entire novel. But as I said, next class I wanted to talk a little bit about writing papers. And I wanted to talk about persuasion as well as a text. But I'm hopeful that you've begun reading Persuasion, and that would be today's attendance question, which would be due on our class discussion forum by June 8th at 9 a.m. Again, if you need an extension, please let me know. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates' posts, but you are required to read your classmates' posts. And my responses in turn, because I respond to everyone. So that'll give you a sense of what we would do during class discussion. So the question is based on what you've read thus far in Persuasion. So I know you might be at the beginnings of your reading or you might be close to finishing. Perhaps you've already finished, because what's ideal is that you're beginning the next text as we're talking about persuasion in your reading. But based on what we've read so far, do you think you would want to be a member of the British landed gentry in Jane Austen's time? Why or why not? So based on what you've learned thus far by reading Persuasion and what you've seen of the Elliot family, do you think you would want to be a member of the British landed gentry? Why or why not? Again, no right or wrong answers. Those are usually the kinds of questions I like to ask, because I'm more really interested in your reasoning than I am in the actual answer itself. So with that said, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about paper number 1 and Persuasion. Take care. Bye-bye.